You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zinno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. As always, we appreciate you joining us each and every week. Before we get started with this week's episode, which is one that does not feature a military member, but one that deals with issues that military members and veterans are fighting and dealing with every single day. More on that in a moment. But a reminder to continue to hit Apple Podcasts. Please get on Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. We want to get to at least 1,000. We're about halfway there right now. We continue to get better in this department, and it's really easy for you guys to do. It doesn't have to be a very lengthy review. In fact, you can do it from your smartphone if you're listening to this via Apple Podcast. If you click on the Hazard Ground and scroll down to the bottom, you'll see a rating and a review. Just leave a quick review. Tell us what you like. Give us 5 stars, and that is it. It is very simple, very fast, and very easy. Speaking of very easy, go to our website, hazardground.com, and click on the Sponsors tab on the top of the homepage or the Amazon button at the bottom of the homepage, and it will direct you right to Amazon, and you can do all your normal Amazon shopping. We'll get a percentage of what you guys spend, and then we'll donate a percentage of that back to the charities and organizations you've heard featured here on the Hazard Ground. It's a very easy way to help out veterans organizations, really from your own house, from your living room, and even on your smartphone. When you go to hazardground.com or your smartphone and you click on the Amazon button, it'll direct you to the Amazon app, so all of your information is still loaded. You don't have to put in your credit card or anything like that. It's very simple and very, very easy. Don't forget to follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hazard Ground Podcast. Subscribe to the YouTube channel. And as always, if you have a guest suggestion, please email us, producer@hazardground.com. And if you have been following us on social media, you'll see us reposting some of the reviews and some of the emails and messages that we're getting from you guys. We love to share those, so continue to give us the feedback about what you love about this show and continue to be part of the Hazard Ground community. Now that that's out of the way, let's get on to this week's episode. Joining us this week on the Hazard Ground is a special guest who is not a member of the military, but works very closely with members of the military and veterans. She is the author of the book Warrior, How to Support Those Who Protect Us. She also co-authored a book called Beyond the Military, A Leader's Handbook for Warrior Reintegration. She is a Harvard graduate and has become one of the nation's most trusted sources for military warfighters and dealing with post-traumatic stress, veteran suicide, and all mental health issues that veterans and service members deal with. You may have seen her work on CNN, NPR, NBC, CBS Radio, and Military Times. She is Dr. Shauna Springer joining us on the Hazard Ground Podcast. Dr. Springer, welcome, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's really good to be here with you.
All right. We talk a ton on the podcast about PTSD, mental trauma, the things that soldiers have to recover from all the time. It's a consistent theme. So as one of the foremost experts in this area, I know our audience is excited to hear your thoughts. What is interesting as I was reading your story before we start is, even though you're not in the military, you sort of grew up in a military household. As I understand it, your father was like a Marine Corps drill instructor to you as a kid.
Yeah, very much so. He literally read The Great Santini and thought that would make a great parenting manual. So many of the things that I experienced growing up were from that mold, including, running at early in the morning with my siblings, miles in the dark, and competing in local track meets, wearing T-shirts that said property of team, our name, and sending us abroad from a young age to do ministry and service-oriented trips by ourselves in different countries for different reasons. So there were all of these, campaigns against fear and helping us overcome our natural boundaries around fear and things that we would otherwise be uncomfortable doing. And it's really what made me feel at home with those who have served, the commitment to service and the deeper values that I was raised with, and the discipline and the teamwork. So yes, I'm not a military service member, but military folks feel like home to me in many cases.
All right. Well, let me dive into this here, just for the audience's sake, and give some more clarity. You talked about your father getting you up 3 times a week at 5 a.m., as young as 5 years old, to run laps in the dark around a local track. You got sent to foreign countries alone, not with your parents there, alone, to go learn about other cultures. You told one story how your father offered you $10 to jump off an Olympic-sized dive platform.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, it's 2021, and by no means am I like, a softie or a sense, but, in today's times, this is like almost abuse-like.
As a mom of kids around that age or a little bit older, I can't imagine doing some of the things to my kids that I grew
have
up
twin
with.
5-year-old boys. Listen, I don't want to get up and run laps at 5 a.m. Like 7:30, okay, I'm all right. But, dragging my kids out of bed in the morning just to get them ready for kindergarten is a challenge. To get them up and moving and running is maniacal, it seems like.
I had nightmares sometimes about being awakened by a sweaty-toothed madman into college, and probably exercised some of that by writing, sort of in these fiction writing pieces that I wrote about some of my early childhood. Now, having said that, my dad is someone that is really an amazing person that I have deep respect for, who's one of the smartest people I've ever met, who fights for people in his way, in his life as a litigator and an attorney. So, he is somebody that is fear-inducing for most adults. I'm wired a little differently. My kids know they're safe from me getting up at like 4 a.m, 5 a.m.
Usually kids love going to grandma and grandpa's. Not in your case.
They love him, but he's different with them, than he was with us. Like that story of the Olympic diving platform. It was one of those, the Olympics came to LA in 1984. Carl Lewis and Greg Louganis and many of the Olympians. And so they had, the Olympic stadiums, and we went out to some of the pools around that time. And kind of checked it out. There was a platform dive. It was a big concrete.
It's a 10-meter platform, right? That's the standard Olympic size.
Yeah.
Okay, so 10 meters for the non-math majors, that's like 30 feet.
It seemed like I was going to just die.
Like that's daunting for adults.
Yeah, it was terrifying. And I couldn't swim. So there was an element of trust. He was in the pool and said, jump and I'll scoop you up. Now, what people need to understand is this is coming on the heels of a lot of other challenges. Like I remember he told my brother that he would give him $10 if he would run out into the middle of like a parade and give a girl that he'd never met a kiss on the hand. So
now, that I would do as a dad. That's me.
So you get enough of that, and it becomes kind of the literally the stream you swim in, right? So when he challenged me and said, "I'll give you $10 and I'm going to pick you up out of the pool," and I believed him and I jumped and I was terrified and I got $10, which felt like a lot of money to me at the time. So looking back, I can see how extreme some of it was, but it's made me a lot less afraid. So I'm ambivalent about some of it. I got to tell you,
Well, let me ask you clinically, as a psychologist here, when you think back on that and you study, is there anything you look at your dad and say, like, there was, I don't want to say misfiring synapses per se, but like psychologically, do you feel like that could have done more harm than good?
This is where the ambivalence comes in, because I wouldn't say that I had an easy childhood, but he is a tremendous asset to a lot of people. And I don't know if I could do the work that I do without having had that childhood. I continually hear from warfighters that they are amazed that I'm not shocked by anything, that I don't have any fear of them, that I don't, emit an anxious energy. They can tell me anything they want to. And it's because I had a lifetime of pushing myself through challenges, not of my own will in the early years, but then later it became something I adopted. So even when I wasn't required to go on these trips in college, I went down to Peru and I lived, on the Amazon River with a group of Shipibo Indians, and we hunted alligators at night. And that was an adventure. I had other, adventures during the summers. And so when my husband and I met back at Harvard, one of our first summers together was we went down to Chile and we did a lot of adventurous things down there when we were dating. So it became a part of my values. And so I don't know. I mean, I feel ambivalent about it.
I have to ask, what was Mom's opinion on all this? I mean, I like swing the kids around and roughhouse with them, and my old lady loses her mind when I do that to the children. Your mom was okay with, you launching from a 10-meter platform into the pool?
My mom is German and Norwegian, and her father was quite a person in his time, and her mom as well. They were both, her grandma was a cut the crap kind of person, I would say, when she was alive. Just cut your guff and get to work. And her dad was an engineer who worked on some kind of high profile war related projects. And so they were extreme people. And I think that, she was right there on all the runs with us. So even if she wasn't pushing for this, way of raising us, she was certainly right along with us.
Wow.
On all those runs.
Now, hypothetically speaking, if I came into your office and told you a story that I did this with my children, clinically, what would you say to a parent?
You got me there. I don't know. I'd be asking a lot of questions. It's different when you put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, again, and no judgment, honestly. I mean, everybody grows up differently, and one thing I've learned in the short time that I've been a parent is you don't critique other people's parenting, and you certainly don't do it to their face. But because everybody's a product of their experiences, and so from that standpoint, that doesn't make you a good or bad parent. I mean, I think there are some things we all genuinely feel are crossing the line, but while this may be out there, I don't know if it crosses the line, especially when you know your children and what they can handle. So I guess I just am expressing, some parental anxiety and trying to understand. And I'm thinking if I was to put my kids through this, what their reaction would be. And I don't really know.
Well, I have, my own, anxiety as a parent now, with little ones. And so I feel you on that. But at the same time, in retrospect, to give him credit, I hear all the time from people, you're so different. You're not like other people that are not military service members. You really understand, and you're not afraid of us. And I hear that so often. And I think it's a lot to do
validation?
With. I mean, it makes some of that pain worth it. And it's, what I've learned about trauma, right, is whether this was a trauma or not, it was painful and it shaped me. And when you take things that are painful and you make meaning out of them, it's an incredible fuel for what you want to do with your life. And so I think it's operated that way in my life. I mean, I'm not raising my kids on the same, kind of model, but, I have ambivalence about it. I see the positive sides of this in retrospect.
Yeah, I'll quote my Catholic school upbringing. St. Thomas Aquinas: "To live is to suffer, to survive is to find meaning in the suffering." And there is some of that, right? And I think that's what we grow from, and that's what we learn from. So I get that much. Was there anything that you did not do that your dad had thrown your way as a kid?
I tried one time. That didn't go so well for me. I tried to be. I was probably the most rebellious, actually, of my siblings, and maybe they found like more, sneaky ways at times. I don't want to give away their stuff, but I was outright rebellious and got, old school punished for that at times. So, it's a different model. And at the same time, like, I wonder when people in the warfighter community say to me things like, "You've been initiated into suffering," I think that's what they mean, is that there's a recognition that we share that has helped me connect with people that I serve, even though I haven't served in the military. I haven't deployed to a war zone. I haven't had a lot of the experiences that people share with me, but my capacity to listen and understand some of those things has been heightened by my own experience growing up and some of the life experiences I've had before I went into being a psychologist.
All right. So I want to ask you about the foreign service trips alone as a child, because I think there's multiple things here, and it sort of leads to what you were just talking about and understanding, even though you've never been deployed. If you've been to some of these countries, you understand depravity. And unfortunately, and I say this repeatedly, I shake my head sometimes at the literal first world problems we complain about on social media these days, because people just generally don't understand. And I don't look down on them for it, because I don't expect them to understand. And I'm not going to, go into the old cliche of how fortunate we are in America and how we listen, not everybody in America is leading a charmed life. I get that. And there is depravity in America, but it's a different kind of depravity when you are in Chile or Peru or some of these other countries that don't have, the structure of government that we have. But I wonder, as a kid, that separation anxiety from parents at a young age, that seems more of the fear than actual survival in a foreign country.
I don't know that I had a lot of that. Maybe it's just my disposition, but I don't remember feeling anxious about being separated from my parents. I remember feeling like I can do this because of what was invested in me before that and all the challenges that had come before. So to me at the time, it was a little bit weird, but I didn't have any comparison. And so like I remember the first trip that I took, they gave me a photo of the family. It was Mexico City was my first trip. And I had my bag and my picture and I flew in. This was the days before cell phones and all that.
Right.
And I was to use the picture to find the family and live with them and help them in any way that they needed help. Well, it turns out their area of service was in what was at the time the second biggest garbage dump in the world, in Mexico City, or so they told me. So we would go out there and, deliver supplies and medicine and things to people that were living in the dump. And that was a really interesting, informative experience that, yes, seared itself into my memory and you might consider a trauma. I remember, as a little kid, I think I was about 10 years old for that trip. There were these men that had cuts on their bodies and they were wearing rags and they were, soiled, in the back, and they just didn't care about anything. They were scrabbling for glue bottles so they could huff glue and get away from the pain of their physical and mental, sort of experience of life, right? Living in the garbage dump, not just scavenging it, but actually living there. But then there were also, these kids, like another memory that's totally locked in for me with crystal clarity. I can see it right now. Are these kids that were running around playing soccer with a little wad of rags that they had fashioned into a ball. And there was broken shards of glass all over this like hard mud packed earth. It's outside. And a row of like cardboard shanty houses all the way down as far as you can see. And they are running around with bare feet, calloused feet, playing soccer and laughing and smiling in the midst of this like human carnage and these people that are trying to find glue so they can huff it. So like those experiences and seeing that, I think at a young age really expanded my sense, like you said, to your point, of the range of how people in the world live and how they can live and find joy and find connection, even in those situations. And then coming back and having the like cultural whiplash of going back into a very, relatively privileged junior high and high school was just a really interesting experience that, again, helps me identify with perhaps what it feels like to go to a war zone and then come back and try and come into a society that has very different values than you've come to hold.
I want to ask you sort of a loaded two-part question.
All right.
And that is also part of, your role now as a psychologist.
Sure.
Do you feel like your dad was sort of living out some deficiencies in his life through his kids? Because we see that often, I think, with parents sometimes when they force kids to do things that they themselves didn't do. And do you feel like maybe your dad was sort of creating his kids or programming his kids on purpose? Like, it seems very intentional what he did.
It was intentional, but I don't think it was to cover up or live out some deficiency. He's a highly successful person who has, 3 degrees from Harvard and who worked very hard to get to where he is. And I think that he consciously did not want to grow up a bunch of kids that had a privileged mindset and didn't understand what it was like to actually have to come from behind. And so I think, if there's any design in that, it was to make sure we weren't limited by anxiety or privilege. And so my sense is that my parents agreed that that was an important value set for both of them and that they pushed us because of their values, that some of which became our values. And, sometimes like any kid, we go our own way and define our own values for our future.
All right. Well, I mean, it's a lot to process from the outside. I can only imagine what it was from the inside. So your dad went to Harvard as well. Is that why you had sort of geared up to go there?
I went back to check out the campus, and I had the kind of feeling that I had when I met my husband and when I found a house that I knew I was going to buy. it was just, I just felt like it was home for me. And so, yes, the reason why it was on the college tour was because, that was a college I wanted to check out, I'm sure in relation to my dad's good experience there. But it was some of the best 4 years of my life. And that was just a time when I really blossomed and became, confident in arguing with my classmates in classrooms, like the way that we would at Harvard is we'd have sections and we would take on a topic and then we would say what we think. And after a high school experience where I was always kind of suppressing really what I thought because I wanted to, not look too smart, I really came into myself and was able to kind of really say what I thought about things and develop my thinking and friendships. And it was a glorious 4 years, honestly.
Did you know you wanted to be a psychologist when you went there?
Nope. I was going to be a lawyer. I was going to take over my dad's law firm. And then I ended up, interestingly, a couple of years ago for my 20th reunion, I ended up being invited to do a panel of people that chose unconventional careers. So most of my classmates, I would say a big majority went into investment banking, consulting, law, or medicine. And I did a panel with a bunch of people that did some really fascinating things. And then I was asked to also kind of be part of the panel and talk about my work in support of our nation's warfighters and how that's, central to my purpose and will always be central to my purpose no matter what else I do as a psychologist.
All right. So when did you get involved in sort of the warfighter community in that tribe, like as far as treating them? I mean, obviously that wasn't your focus going in, right? It wasn't about military. It was just about helping people or I know you do a lot of stuff with relationships and marriage as well.
Yeah.
Like, what was your initial focus when you started?
Yeah. So thanks. Great questions. A lot of stuff coming up. So I did 10 years really focused on close relationships before I ever started working with the military population. And someday I'll get back to kind of bringing those two things together more intentionally. But that involved a study of 200 newlywed couples that we followed over 4 years. That was part of my PhD program. And then I did a lot of study and work with couples. And during my internship year, excuse me, during my internship year, I did a rotation at the Gainesville VA. And that's where I first felt like, oh, there's something different about this population. And I really enjoy working with this population. There's something about a shared value set. And it was almost like a kind of a recognition, even though, again, I don't want to say that I'm like exactly, if anything, it's an honor that I've been adopted into the tribe by the warfighter community as much as I have. I'm not a military veteran, but there was a feeling of just mutual respect and recognition that I started to see during that internship. And then I took a full-time position in a VA and was in the VA for 8 years. And that's when I really blossomed in my professional line of work and in terms of a population that was really important to me.
So, I mean, there's a lot of this center around 9/11 and, obviously post that is when all of this really, became a real thing. But even that, it didn't happen until, 10 years after 9/11 when we started actually using the word PTSD, in common usage. But when do you actually start in your career with veterans?
Yeah, so I was 2009 was when I started in the VA. And so I don't really think it was related to 9/11 or, to be honest, very intentional on my part. It kind of took me by surprise. It wasn't something I had planned out and, orchestrated long ago. I just recognized that I really liked working with this population. And so I came to work at the VA. I was a general mental health psychologist, and it was before we had PTSD specialty teams. So what that meant was that I was one of 2 psychologists when I came into that VA, and I saw everyone who came in along with, the rest of the team, of course, but all kinds of issues, not just post-traumatic stress, but everything. So in order to make that work, I had to think in terms of groups of people and issues that were coming up for patients. And so I started really getting a head start on thinking about issues like moral injury, like how do I build trust with veterans as a civilian, survivor guilt, these themes among this huge group of patients I was serving, because I kind of had to to survive is to sort of bunch people together in groups or think about how I can get better at treating them, because there was just such a volume of need when I came into that job.
All right. So there's a lot to dissect when it comes to, veterans and the issues that they deal with. Prior to this work, how much of an understanding, and this is an insulting question, how much of an understanding did you have of PTSD and what soldiers deal with, transition, survivors get like? I mean, it's not something that, I'm sure it comes up in the normal course of when people lose family members and everything, but there's a little nuance to it when it comes to veterans.
Yeah, there's a lot. I had no understanding. None. So when, my first week on the job, I got a list of 100 patients and they said, these people have been waiting a long time to, have us bring you on board. Some of them are really angry. Call them and find out what they need. I thought I was, there, fresh troops had arrived, and I got totally cut down by one of them who said basically, like, who do you think you are? Who do you think, why do you think you can understand me when you haven't had any of my experiences? Now, it wasn't personal, but he was right. That really sent me down a path of, do I have what it takes to really support those I'm here to walk with? And that question changed everything for me, because out of that sense of, I don't know if I do understand, I started to think differently about some of the things that we take for granted. For example, I think one of the huge misconceptions is that what veterans see and do in war is the source of their trauma. Sometimes. But a lot of times they're just too scared to say, it didn't bother me that I had to kill that person. That's what a soldier does. It wasn't that really bothered me, but this thing over here, just surviving when one of my brothers was killed, that was the trauma. That's the thing I've locked 10 levels in the vault and have never talked to anyone about. So the things that we think are the trauma are often projections of our own experience based on who we are and what we've experienced and what we would find traumatizing. And so the reason I wrote my book Warrior is to shed light on all of these areas that I really think that 10 years ago, and many people need to understand much differently than we do now.
One of the things I talk about a lot with guests on the show is the concept that the person you were before you went to combat, that person dies when you go to combat. Whether something bad happened to you or not, that experience alters you forever, and you're never the same again. I was fortunate enough to, leave combat with, not many physical wounds, but I know damn well that the world I saw before I went to combat, I'll never see it again, because I just don't look at things the same way, because it is such an altering experience. And the only people who tend to understand it, and this is part of the isolation issue that we deal with, are other people who went through it with us. And I think bridging that gap and finding people who you can relate to is incredibly difficult. But, let's stay with the idea that the person dies. What have you learned about combat that, is a theme that changes people the most, beyond the simple stuff of bombs and bullets and blood and all the other stuff?
Yeah, well, it certainly is an initiation. And one of the things that will never be the same again, to your point, is that you'll never just inhabit one world. That one of the underappreciated sacrifices is that you're always going to hold these two worlds and these two selves in tension. And that can create a lot of problems for people if they don't have someone to really walk with them through the reintegration process. So there's the, person you are as a warfighter or warrior, the qualities you need to have to do that job well are various, qualities. And, like one of the examples, and really it came from conversation and writing that Carl Marlantis has done, so I need to give credit for this, but really working through this concept that you can, as a warfighter, be okay with or even feel happy about taking someone out if they're a threat to you and your brothers and sisters in arms, and not be a sociopath.
There is so much context lost. I have always boiled it down to one simple thing: him or me. The choice is easy from that standpoint. I can
Right.
cognitively, there's cognitive dissonance there that I can clear. Not a problem. I mean, it doesn't keep me up at night, never has, never will.
Right.
Because it was more important for me to bring home everybody that was with me than anything else. And the whole
That's right.
need to make an omelet, break a few eggs. It's the normal course of business, right?
Right.
As callous as that is,
It isn't, though, in that context.
right.
What mother wouldn't take out somebody that threatens her kid? In that context, it isn't.
And context is so important. And in the political sense, it's awful hard when we have to deal with people who wear a suit and they're 50,000 miles away making decisions on how and when I can fire my weapon at the enemy. You're not standing where I am. Your life is not in danger. It's easy for you to put these constraints on me, but at the end of the day, the mental process that we have to go through to survive one way or another sometimes isn't 100% in our hands, and that also is a source of frustration.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, just for my, the link to me when you say that is to be effective. It really wasn't about what I came to learn in any academic sense or even in the clinical space where I worked for so many years. I really started to understand what it takes to support warriors when I got outside of the clinical space and started going into these private reunions and groups and got embedded in the veteran community in a different way as a doc and not just sort of like a doctor who comes into the rule of like, here I have these, diagnoses and I'm going to figure out what's wrong with you and then develop this, treatment plan that's going to get you better. It was a whole different shift in how I approached practice, and getting in there with them in the trenches of mental warfare for so many years was such a part of that shift for me.
All right. There's so much here. I don't even know where I want to go next. Let's stay with PTSD for a minute.
Sure.
What do we know now about PTSD that we didn't know 10, 15 years ago?
I am so glad you asked that question. So I just gave a talk this morning about this for an addiction summit about how post-traumatic stress has traditionally been seen as a disorder, as an invisible injury, if it is considered an injury, and as something that frankly is a life sentence. Like once you have it, you'll always have it. So it's going to change the rest of your life and there's no true healing. What we know now, based on the work of Ella as their chief psychologist, is that when you fuse biological, psychological, and mind-body practices in a strategic way, people really can achieve incredible healing from their worst symptoms, often very efficiently, and that it's not a life sentence. It is a biological injury that can be seen with the right brain scan. So that's a paradigm shift that I'd really like to advance for everybody that's suffering from trauma, whether in the military or civilian population.
See, that's interesting because I've never been clinically diagnosed, and I've shared some stories here on the podcast. But I don't know that the things that still afflict me all these years later, I just resigned to the fact that they're part of me, like they'll never go away. Certain flashbacks I have, certain things that I do, certain behaviors that have become innate to me in my post-combat experience that I guess, I don't know, it's a weird thing. Like when I go to a restaurant, everybody knows I won't sit my back to the door. I won't ever sit my back to the door. It's a natural thing for me to scan every room I walk in and find every point of egress and entry. And I run through my head in an oh shit scenario. What do I do before I even sit down at a table somewhere? It's a natural process for me. And I don't think that's how normal people think, right? I just, some of that you can chalk up to training per se, but that's not what normal people do when they go sit down at a restaurant, right? Like that's,
it is how normal people act when they've been exposed to the environments you've been exposed to. It's exactly how a logical person would act, right? So, I mean, getting aside from like diagnosis, what I've really been calling this in my work is just being in a state of chronic threat response.
yes.
And that's this, like the way that my patients have described it is they can't throttle down. That they're always at this like state where they're like a muscle car and they can't calm themselves down very easily. So the chronic sleep disruption, the difficulties concentrating, the surges of irritability, the anxiety attacks. Sometimes people get startle response when someone comes up behind them, and they're always hypervigilant, doing that thing like scanning and having like the situational awareness that's really adaptive, when you're in a combat zone where people are trying to kill you. But it's really difficult in the translation back to most of civilian society. So, I mean, I don't know what I've seen, and I've treated 40 patients with, I got to tell you about Dr. Lipoff, Dr. Eugene Lipoff, world-renowned anesthesiologist, figures out in 2006, I can do an injection of an anesthetic into a cluster of nerves in the neck, and it can reboot the adrenaline system. And it addresses the hyperarousal part of PTS, all those symptoms I was just describing. So now you can get in there when people are calm in their own bodies, and a great psychologist can get in there and work on the thinking and behavior that maintains the trauma response. And people can change patterns that they thought were always just going to be a part of their life. So I've seen that, repeatedly over the past couple of years.
Yeah. And again, I'm for the audience, I'm going through my own experiences, and I hate telling my own war story. Like, it's not what this is supposed to be about, but I'm just trying to sort of, for the sake of the audience, give concrete examples.
Context.
That they can understand. I'll say this. I was doing a podcast with another guest. His name is Pasha Palanker, so shout out to Pasha. And he made me realize something that I did not. What scared me the most about PTSD was that it almost seems like you can pass it on. Like, we talked a lot about reactions that we have, like snap reactions, and how we can quickly, as you said, elevate, right, to a certain level. And he told me that he realized that he didn't want to pass it on to his kids, and it scared the ever-loving hell out of me. And to this day, it scares me, because I think I am fearful that my reaction to certain things, even when the kids don't put the toys back or something small that doesn't warrant that reaction, that I'm almost passing that behavior on to them, and they don't deserve that.
That is a primary reason that a number of the warfighters I've served have been willing to try something that sounds at first unbelievable to them. To say, hey, we've got this new innovative treatment where we can do a shot in your neck and it will calm you back down and give you self-command instead of flying off the handle and then regretting it and feeling shame and fear about, what you're doing to your family. That is a primary reason why they're willing to even try this. And so a lot of the people that we have served have been Marine Corps veterans, people that have served in the Army, that have been in that have felt, I don't want this to sound like an infomercial, but it's honestly, it's one of the most promising things I've seen in 20 years. And it's just so, it's not okay with me that people don't know about the availability of this kind of innovation and other innovations that are available. Wounded Heroes is a movie I got to put in a plug for. I'm not getting paid for this, but I interviewed for this movie, Wounded Heroes. It's a documentary about maybe 6 or 8 alternative non-medication treatments, including stellate ganglion block, what I'm talking about here, that are not psychoactive medication treatments that are very effective in treating post-traumatic stress. And so Michael Geyer, the filmmaker, traveled all over the country, heard a lot about the rage in the veteran population around over-drugging, medicating, and explored and profiled these different treatments that are effective for post-traumatic stress. And that drops in March, I think March 5th. So just recommend that if anybody's out there listening, there are treatments that work. We're innovating all the time. And don't let people tell you that, you got to be stuck with this, because that movie profiles several treatments that I'm not involved in, but are very, very effective.
You mentioned drugs, and it sort of brings me to the opioid issue, that we deal with soldiers who are wounded, but also the self-medication aspect of this whole thing. Listen, it's not shocking that anybody who has a bad day wants a stiff drink at the end of it, right? Like, and
right.
stiff drink may lead to 10 stiff drinks and so on and so forth, and a whole bunch of bad decisions. I don't think that that's unrelatable to anybody who's non-military, but the underlying causes of that obviously are more of the bigger issues. So where do you sit on medication? Do you have a general sort of stance on medication, and how do we sort of curb the self-medicating that veterans do?
I do have a stance. I shared some of it for that movie when I interviewed, but basically my stance is this. I have had patients for whom a mood stabilizing medication, like a bipolar medication or a antidepressant medication, was life-changing for them. So I don't want to promote the message that all medication is bad. However, it's the over-medication, and the idea of that is when you lose self-command, you lose control of the process. So what a lot of, I think, patients will get into is a cycle where, one medication causes sort of an unfortunate side effect, in some way. And so then they are put on a second medication, and then it kind of just like adds up and accrues into this layered effect of being on so many medications for such a young person. And then you're talking about just alcohol and that being a thing that people do, right? Same principles. When a person doesn't feel like they're in control of that, when it's not something that they're taking out of their own free will and it's a healthy decision, but it's really taking over their life and they don't really have a choice, that's when you want to take a look at it and say, how is this affecting me? Is this affecting me, my relationships, what I want to do with the time and energy I've been given in life? That's where you want to look at that, whether that's alcohol or lots of psych meds.
I mean, how do we clinically, and how do you clinically, when it comes to any prescription medication, behavior, antidepressants, whatever you were mentioning before, what's the line? Like, when do you just up the dosage because it's not enough, and when do you decide that the medication isn't working? And because it almost seems like a lot of this over the last 10 years has been trial by error. And unfortunately, the veterans are the ones paying the price for it, because there's not a lot of, there isn't any studies on this, right? Like, we just don't have the data points at this point to know enough about the whole thing. Now, in another 10 years, after 20 plus years of combat, we probably should. But in the meantime, the course of business I talked about earlier, well, the course of business in this case is veterans are dying at a rate that is unacceptable.
Yeah, so I'm not a psychiatrist, so I don't prescribe medications, but I've worked with good psychiatrists, and I can say from that experience that they use a very careful and conservative scientific process, and the veteran feels empowered through the process if it's working well. So what that looks like in practice is instead of let's try these 3 medications, you just try one and you see how it goes, and you make a decision, whether or not to stay on that. And when they start adding up, then you really start to look at that. And whether or not the person needs to be on a medication or not in the first place, or stay on it, or just for a short time, that's a decision that patients should feel empowered to discuss and need to be able to advocate for themselves. If they feel like they're just getting, pills from their docs and they don't have a voice in that, that's a problem. Like, that's a problem. This is not an extension of a system where you have to just, take 2 Motrin and move on. Although I respect and, have great respect for our military, that's a complaint that I hear often, is that, it's just sort of like, here's your, Motrin, a vitamin, M, and, suck it up and move on. When you come out of the military, you are reclaiming your rights as a citizen, a full citizen. And that means being able to advocate for yourself. And that means being able to say, no, that doesn't feel right for me, or I don't want to be on a medication, or let's try it, and maybe just for a short time and then I'll come off it. So I'm talking about general principles, because prescribing medications, adjusting them, it's really not my field or scope. So I want to stay in my scope and give some general principles, to help. Yeah.
What in your experience has been tougher when it comes to veterans? Transitioning out of the military, or reintegrating and decompressing after combat? And what are the similarities and differences?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would have to say, if I had to compare them, it's transitioning out of the military. Both are hard. Don't get me wrong. The decompression and the elasticity that it takes to go between roles and between worlds and selves is very difficult. So I want to say that. But what I've seen is that many people, people of strength and courage and, people that, you wouldn't expect to struggle, they do. That they often hit a wall in the transition out of the military. And so my book in 2019 with Jason Roncaroni, Beyond the Military, is a 400-page book about the psychological, cultural, and relationship factors that are high risk factors around military transition. And right now, we see military transition in terms of what's going to be, the way to update your resume and get your next job. And we're looking at it as though military service members are coworkers, and the central task is to help them find their next paid gig. And I don't think, and Jason, my co-author, we sort of reject that whole premise. And we say, no, this is really about how do you support someone who is losing their family, who just got cut off from people they love like family, and a way of life and an identity, roles and responsibilities that have given them purpose and meaning. How do you support someone through that? It is a gut punch. And there are so many psychological and cultural and relationship factors. Like, I can't tell you how many of my patients had a super strong relationship break up during transition. And so I wrote 80 pages in that book about relationship-focused risk factors around military transition, because it's such a gut punch. And I don't think we're really factoring that in with our formal programming around transition.
Yeah, I mean, I have remarked several times, because I'm in the latter stages of my career, I keep reminding people, at some point in time, we're all going to be told that we have to take the uniform off. Some people, it's voluntary and they do it after 4 years. Some people, it is forced after 24, 34 years. But we're all going to have to take the uniform off. And I keep reminding people, I've spent more of my life in a uniform than I have out of it.
Right.
And it is part of the very fabric of who I am. Now, I don't think it identifies me in any way, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't completely scared about the day where I don't get to call myself, member of the U.S. Army anymore, because I don't know who that person is. I've never met that individual before.
Yeah, well, you're in good company, because, going through that process and feeling like you've been stripped of your identity is a trauma for people. And, what they discover, the good news is, if they go through the process in a well-informed way with the right insights and the right support, they come to see that the qualities that made them a warrior are deeper than the uniform or what they did in the time in service. That what a warrior is, and let me maybe share this with you. This is just my definition of what a warrior is somebody who is willing to, who has clarity of thought about the sacred values that they would be willing to give their life for, the people that they would die for, and they have the willingness to make personal sacrifices, continual personal sacrifices in support of those people or those sacred values. And that is not something that you have to kill off when you transition out. It is something that you actually need to, I believe, reclaim, and it's part of your evolution as a warrior throughout your lifespan. But I don't think veterans are getting that message. I think they're being told that, it's the end of their time and there's nothing really left that's going to make them feel that good.
I want to ask you this question very broadly for a reason. Mm-hmm. How do we curtail veteran suicide?
One of the things that we need to stop doing is using models that work for civilians with warfighters. So there's a unique psychology and a unique area of vulnerability and an Achilles heel, really, in our warfighter community around their culture of interdependence and support for others and their guiding values that are not integrated into our suicide prevention approaches. So it's really, in detail in my book, I sort of break down, I'll tell you the process that you read about in my book is from going into these private circles and these reunions. I say to them, what do your demons tell you? The word they use, not, like literal demons, at the end of the tunnel when you want to self-destruct. And then because I was an English major before I was a psychologist, I'm listening for like the themes and what are the themes in those stories? And how can I understand this narratively? And what is the campaign of the enemy? And then I went and read the Marine Rifle Squad manual and kind of brought that into the mix. So what you'll see in my book, Warrior, is kind of a psyops analysis of how we can get traction with mental warfare based on an understanding of the culture of service and the unique vulnerabilities of our warfighter community. And that's a whole different kind of line of insights. The kind of approaches that we've used, public messaging campaigns and things like that in the civilian sector.
What are some of the main causes that we're seeing for suicide?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll give you a couple of examples, and there's many more, that I talk about in Warrior, but I'll give you a couple of specific examples. The mere survival of someone when someone they love, like family, like a brother or sister in arms, is killed, changes their entire moral framework for the rest of their life. So then imagine that they come home and they transition and they struggle like a lot of people do. And they go through a crash and burn time like a lot of people do, where maybe they're drinking too much, maybe it's hard to find the right job, they fall into some depression, they yell at their wife, their kids. What people tend to do is think back to that person they lost, and they will compare themselves to the ghost of the person they lost. And they will say, who am I that's worthy to live when someone that never would have struggled like this has died and been killed and taken in battle? I'm not worthy to live. And so that can send them down a whole kind of unique psychological trail that is very, very dangerous for them. A second example is, I remember, and I talk about this in the books, like the sessions I had with veterans who had just lost a brother or sister to suicide, which happens, if you think about the numbers that we're losing, it happens often. So it's the burden of grief that people in the military tribe feel is way disproportionate than people in the civilian world. Why do they die?
No, why is the burden of grief bigger?
Because they're losing people in their line of, in the calling that they've pursued. They're losing people in these sudden, unanticipated, traumatic ways, whether it's training accidents, because it's a high-risk profession, whether it's people being killed in combat during deployments, and the suicide. So I remember, talking to these Marines that I'm close to, and frequently they will reach out and say, I'm a pallbearer, or I have to go to another funeral this weekend. And there's just no analog for that among the network of people that I enjoy friendship with in the civilian world, to be continually going to funerals and having to serve as pallbearers and to be so close to so much loss, stacked on loss. That is a unique thing that many of our military service members experience that civilians don't often have, maybe more this year, with, unfortunately, people this year are feeling grief and loss that is, somewhat similar to what the military population has felt with the losses due to COVID and other causes this year. So some veterans are saying to me, I feel a little bit less alien because I feel like people maybe can understand a little bit more what it feels like to walk around the world with 1,000 pounds of grief on your back.
Part of me always has looked at it as more anger and frustration when it comes to veteran suicide, because it's like we fought our asses off to survive of what most people can't survive. And to have it taken away from you in an arena where we could have done something to stop it is a big source of grief and anger and frustration, I think.
Yeah, the worst feeling for a warrior is helplessness. It's the worst feeling. And so that's why I think, going back to the other example of those sessions where people would come into my office having just lost a brother or sister in arms to suicide, with questions that were just that would never have an answer, were high stakes, high risk times when there was so much anger at themselves for not seeing it. What does this mean for me? What does this mean for our relationship? Was our trust real? Why didn't he tell me? Doesn't he know I would have dropped everything and come to him? Like if he had just told me how bad it was. There was anger at the person who died. There was anger at, systems of care for perceived lack of responsiveness, anger at the spouse, anger at the parents, anger at the military, rage, just obliterating rage. And under rage, we know that there's other emotions. And one of those, emotions is, as you say, it's helplessness, which is pervasive. And that's why I wrote the tactical analysis of mental warfare, because people get pissed in a good way. Once they see the game and they understand the threats of the campaign of the enemy are predictable. There's certain messages that you'll hear, and there's a predictable way that you can deploy what you have that's going to be a power stronger than despair. But you really have to understand that and have the right insights and the right support. And that's how I would want to change our suicide prevention strategy when it comes to the warfighter and veteran community.
Why don't soldiers talk more? Like, I mean, I just think about me personally.
Yeah.
There are places that I haven't gone and things that I haven't discussed. Mostly, and this is just me personally, mostly because I don't want to peel that Band-Aid off. I know the wound is there. I'm reminded of it repeatedly. I exist pretty peacefully for the most part, but there are certain times where I think about certain things and the emotion seems to overwhelm me, and then I quickly escape from that place because I don't want to feel all those feelings again.
Of course.
But what are some of the reasons why soldiers, have you found, have trouble talking or don't talk at all?
There's a lot of reasons. It's always like everything very complicated. So it depends on, who we're talking about. I'll give you some examples. So one of the themes that I've seen when soldiers don't talk to their wives, for example, is that usually you trace that upstream and there's a self-protective or other protective instinct. So it's a protective instinct that's usually at play. So for example, I don't want my spouse to live with the images that I live with. I want to protect her or him or whatever from experiencing those same things in their mind's eye. Or I don't want my spouse to see me as a monster or see me as a different person than I want to protect, how that person I love that I need sees me. And I'm not going to do anything to risk that. Or I don't want to risk getting the wrong response or an unhelpful response, or maybe my spouse will confirm that he or she doesn't really understand where I'm coming from, right? And then even with like other warriors, it's not true that people are going to talk about their stuff freely, because there's also a concern there with, well, does it make me look like, this
Weak.
is affecting me, right? More than them, right? So there's this, or, do we really want to dredge all of it up? Or are people going to be upset at me? There's a number of reasons why people don't talk about it. And one of the things that I think is so important, which I've seen work, is to create these circles where this stuff gets reckoned with directly. Because, this is not a confrontation here. Don't hear it that way. But just as a challenge, like the harder thing to do here is to face the problem and to take your armor off with people that are trustworthy and address it directly. And when you don't, that is something that can lead to unending distress in your life. And for some people can lead to a crisis, a mental health crisis. So having the ability to really walk with people in trust and be open with some people in your life, whether it's a trustworthy doc or a trusted spouse or a brother or sister in arms, that you can create that core unit around you, that you can take off your armor and not feel shame to share whatever's on your mind, is very important.
I feel like I'm in a session right now. I'm not going to lie.
Well, you asked a psychologist on. Sorry, I don't know any other way to be.
I have too much guy. My head's a pretzel right now. It's a big pretzel.
Oh crap!
No, it's all.
I'm trying to unkink.
Yeah,
people.
it's all great information. I know our audience is seeing it that way. So how do we know when soldiers get better? Like, what does healing look like? And I know it's different for everybody, obviously.
Yeah.
But I'm just kind of curious as far as, some of the examples that you've seen, where you can tell you get that, breakthrough is the psychological term, right? We had an emotional breakthrough. When do we see those, and how do we know what they look like?
That is fun. That is a fun part of my job. And I get to see it all the more often now that we have a way of really getting people calm in their own bodies and then taking in a range of new insights. Their face changes. I mean, it is different for everybody, but their face changes. It's like hard to describe it, but it's almost as though there's like a shift from like attention and like a just weight to a sense of purpose and like integrity, in the sense of like being aligned with your purpose. So some of the work, that I've done in groups and with individuals have entailed, setting a course for themselves with personal challenges that align them with their warrior code. And this is after the military. This is, that bigger definition of what it is to be a warrior. And they will go out and do these amazing things. This is one of the things I really like working with veterans around, is because they know you take a hill, like you take that challenge, and when they're persuaded, like that's the harder thing to do, is reckon with your problems directly and evolve, keep evolving as a warrior. And you'll be stronger in the end when you do that. To answer your question, people get reinvigorated with a sense of meaning and purpose, and they use their pain and their grief and their trauma as fuel for doing incredible things that are very personally meaningful to them. And that's what varies. People, apply it to different things they care about, but that's when I know somebody's really turned a corner.
Difficult question to answer. If it's true we are all a product of our experiences, is there anything we should change, in your professional opinion, about the military and the way we train that would alleviate some of these problems down the road, if that makes sense? Like, you said it before, we're taught to suck it up and drive on, right? It's a phrase, we suck it up and drive on. And we have learned that that's great for combat. That's great for training. Yeah. That's great for mission accomplishment. It's not great when you're struggling, right? Post-military life. Like, suck it up and drive on is not a solution, because it only ends up leading you to bad decisions. So is there anything about the military, theoretically, that we could change in the way we train and how we raise people in the military that might prevent some of these things down the road from happening?
Yeah, that's actually not an easy or a hard question at all for me.
It seemed like a hard one for me, because it takes the military a while to change anything in the way they train. Just,
well, it's hard, good initiative, but, hard to deploy, right? What I really think is missing, back to our early part of our conversation. Look, I have tremendous respect for how the military trains warfighters. We have the most amazing military force in the world because of how we train people for battle. And we use really intentional psychological practices to prepare people for doing the work of a warrior. What I think is missing that could be added to part of the way we build warriors, Marines, soldiers, and otherwise, is that I think we could be helping people understand the dimension of mental warfare and how that plays out and how that gets a grip on you, and how the values that you're instilled with can become unique risk factors if you don't understand them. So what I see is that a lot of people, whether they're in command situations and they're trying to, lead the people under them, or military leaders or others, feel this pervasive sense of helplessness around suicide and the loss of people, whether active duty or in the veteran status. And I think if we trained in an understanding of the psychological analysis of mental warfare, that would change. People would recognize it and have a way of addressing it. The other thing is, I think, to your point, it's one thing to kind of be in a zone where you need to compartmentalize. I don't judge that or think it's wrong. Actually, I say that's what you need to do to survive that scenario and that situation. But going back to our earlier conversation that we inhabit two worlds, the warrior inhabits two worlds, you have to balance that out with inhabiting and living in the other world of reconnection to people and to values. And we do that by taking off our armor at times in an emotional sense and walking with people in this deep trust that we claim to have with people we would die for. And so that's a different kind of courage than the courage it takes to walk through go into a firefight. And a lot of warriors would prefer the firefight to the taking off of their emotional armor with people that they love and trust. But not doing that doesn't provide the balance of inhabiting both worlds, and that'll be a problem down the line. Does that make sense?
No, it does. I mean, I've always said, and I recognize this after my first deployment, surviving is kind of the easy part, right? Like combat in a sense, deploying in a sense is easier. I don't have to worry about the day-to-day grind of mortgage, bills, kids, soccer practice, whatever it may be. The wife wanting you to do this, the husband wanting you to do that. Like, I mean, all those things that sort of are the normal stresses of every day. It's almost a relief in combat that all you got to do is keep your ass alive. Like, it's a really simple task. Like, it's not as difficult as you'd think. The consequences are much different, if you don't take out the trash as opposed to if you don't, clear the building the right way. But in reality, for most of us, like, it's to that end, combat's easy. Like, easy. Mentally, it's easy to process. It's easy to process. I have a task and I know how to accomplish it, and that's it. And there's nothing to distract you from it. There are distractions that sort of weigh you down in regular life. And I think that's part of the other part of transition is getting back to those distractions on top of, what you have just went through that sort of compound things or exponentially make it difficult.
Yeah, you're right. Like, as a civilian who's never been in combat, I can't agree that, like, it's easy to be in combat. You can say that. You have the moral authority to say that. I don't. But I do think, I hear often that there's a real ability to focus and an immediacy of purpose that is a psychological relief over all the things that are like pulling at you and distracting you. But you have to be able to navigate both worlds.
That's why when you're in combat, the most dangerous thing that happens to a soldier in a deployment area or in a war zone is if something back home is tugging at them, because it takes their focus away, right? Whether it's, maybe there's relationship issues or a child is sick or whatever, that laser focus that you have to stay alive now all of a sudden is being distracted by things that you have no control over. And we talked about the hopelessness, right? And the lack of control that drives us nuts. Like, that is what makes combat difficult. You mess with a soldier's pay, you mess with a Marine's family, all of a sudden, the focus that they take into combat is now deterred.
Right. And so, to do that and to have that laser focus, there are people at home, spouses and family members, who are just navigating things on their own and trying to keep their soldier, their Marine, from being distracted. And that will change a relationship over time. So that needs to be re-knit together after transition and between combat deployments so that that family can come together and re-navigate their roles as a couple so that the relationship doesn't become one of resentment and, somebody controlling one entire area of the relationship and the other person feeling like they're on the outside.
I want to give you a chance to sort of shamelessly plug outlets, medias, places people can go, whatever you're working with. If you want to give out a whole bunch of information now where soldiers, Marines, airmen, whoever it is that, may want to get help or are curious about ways that they can improve the quality of their life, I want to give you sort of a platform to tell everybody.
Thank you. I would say that if you go to www.DocShaunaSpringer, it's DocShaunaSpringer.com, you can find my books, and there are links to different resources, podcasts, articles I've written various places. Stella Center is linked to my website, and that website as well is www.stellacenter.com, where we're doing some really innovative work around a biological approach to treating post-traumatic stress. So that would be a second place. And then I've just launched an Instagram page, and I'm not very good with it, so I need a lot of patience. But if you're good at that, or you want to connect, or sort of like, help me have one more person I connect with on there, please find me there as well.
All right. Well, I mean, again, it has been an amazing learning lesson. I feel like I just got a free session, so I feel much more co-joined to society once again. But no, I mean, in reality, there's so much here, right? I mean, it's impossible to nearly encompass it in a couple of hours or however long we've been talking. So but I do think the point that we bring to light is that there are more avenues now than there ever were before for veterans and soldiers and Marines and airmen to go get help, right? To go talk about it. And thankfully, the military at its glacier pace is slowly starting to allow mental health to be part of the complete body of work that is, a U.S. military member. And so to that end, I think that it's really, we're taking the right steps.
Yeah, I feel so strongly that there are insights we need to integrate, that I wrote about them in Warrior, How to Support Those Who Protect Us. And for people who don't want to read a book, I read it to you. So there's an audiobook version that's available now as well, if people want to listen to it. And I just think there's so much hope, because there are so many innovations I've become aware of where PTS, post-traumatic stress, does not have to be a life sentence. You really can accomplish an amazing amount of recovery with some of the things that we're doing now.
Again, the book is Warrior, How to Support Those Who Protect Us. She also co-authored Beyond the Military, a leader's handbook for warrior reintegration, and the website, DocShaunaSpringer.com, DocShauna Springer, like it sounds, .com. I can't thank you enough for sharing your expertise, your time, and certainly just a wonderful conversation. And I hope that, for those listening out there, that you guys are getting something from this, guys and gals are getting something from it that will start to change your life in a positive direction. Because reminder again, that they're, as you said, none of what we have done is a life sentence, right? Like, I think that's the most important thing. We're not stuck in the position that we are, and we can change our future, and the experiences that built us don't have to be the experiences that define us for the future. Yeah, warriors are really good at changing everything once they have their minds set on what needs to, be the challenge. So absolutely happy to come on. It was fun. Thank you for having me. No, Dr. Shauna Springer, thank you so much for being part of the Hazard Ground.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground podcast, hosted by Mark Zinno. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at producer@hazardground.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.